Welcome to Keith's shop. This is part 2 of the video on how I'm making these vases. And in the part 1 we saw how I designed it, how I laid it out, and how I cut the wedges for it. In this segment we're going to show how we're going to glue them together and then put the rings together and then turn it and finish it. So hope you enjoy that. Have a great day.
Now that we have all the wedges cut, we can start gluing them together. And I showed here that I'm assembling them, gluing them up, and then using hose clamps to clamp them in place while the glue dries. It's interesting, they're very versatile, that if your hose clamp isn't big enough, you can just put 2 or 3 together to make them the right size for attaching them. And I found it best, I just use my cordless drill with an extension and then a socket on the end that matches the hex bolt on the hose clamp itself. I'm using waterproof glue for these vases that I'm making. I wanted them to be waterproof in case someone did put water in them. However, I don't think it'd be wise to do that, so I chose Type-On 3 for the glue for that. And here shows 2 of the rings assembled with the feature segments in the ring itself and put together here. Once I got all these put together, then I went through and did some sanding on them. There's 14 feature rings containing 2 crosses each in each vase, and you have to make sure the crosses are oriented right across from each other, 180 degrees across from each other. And the other thing is, have to make sure that they're in the same orientation, the same side up on the crosses. Not that I've done it the opposite way. I fortunately did not do any mistakes like that on these. Once I got all the rings glued up and let the glue set for a bit, I went ahead and sanded them smooth using a drum sander. This is a homemade drum sander I made for my shopsmith, and I have a separate video on my YouTube channel. You can see how I made it. It's a very inexpensive and works like a charm. And then here's all the actually this is all the, well, I guess this is all the feature rings completed and ready to assemble in the vase. And it includes 1 ring in here. You notice there's no cross on it. That's the extra ring I put in for that will be made into the tenon that attaches the 2 halves together. I also was making 3 vases at a time on this go around, so I labeled not only the layer or which ring it was, but also the A, B, or C depending on which vase it went to. Now that I have all the rings glued together and sanded flat, it's time to start assembling the vase. And I did this in 2 halves, from the bottom up and from the top down. Now I added 1 to 2 rings at a time. I rounded the outside first and then the inside. Then I turned the inside very close to the finished size. I left just a little bit smaller so that it'd be easier to merge into the next ring when I glued that on. In this case I show the top half. It shows the faceplate with the sacrificial blank on it, and then the first ring from the top, walnut. Again, I'm only using a 1/2 inch of this walnut, but I left it a little bit thicker to give me some room to work there. And likewise on the bottom half I have the faceplate, and I have the mounting blank screwed to that, and the bottom ring. Likewise, I'm only using a 1/2 inch thickness of that, so I left that a little thicker. I think both the top and the bottom walnut rings were about 7/8 of an inch thick. Then I glued each of the rings, successive rings, onto this. I used large hand screw clamps, so while I still had the capability to do that, I was able to do that for the first few rings that I added. Then it was just too thick for the hand screw clamps to do that. And here I've added the second set of rings. So the top half, this is going to be, in this case I've showed the ash one mounted to the top. Notice that I've staggered the seam between the segments. The walnut one is centered here, and I've gone halfway in between that for the for each successive ring, and I did that for all the rings itself. And likewise on the bottom one, I actually turned the base round before I added the ash ring on, but still I oriented the seams between the segments halfway in between the previous one. When the assembly got too thick that my clamps would not reach to clamp it, I chose an alternative approach to do that. I used some cinder blocks that I had. First thing I did is I made a board with a hole in it that would go over the collar of the faceplate and allow me to help balance the cinder blocks on it. And this shows 2 cinder blocks, but I actually reverted to using 3 cinder blocks for each one to add a little extra weight to it. And the biggest thing you have to pay attention is the orientation of the crosses, making sure they're rotating around properly. And notice the bottom one is on the left and the top half is on the right. So the orientation or the progression of the crosses is the same, but they're upside down here on the bottom half and right side up on the top half. In fact, I show the details of this here. So I'm trying to align the center of the cross with the seam that's half out on the other one. So I'm not lining the crosses themselves, but staggered them on there, and the same goes for the top half too. And I just try to line that seam with the center of the prior ring itself. And you have to make sure again the orientation of the crosses is correct and the progression is correct. Actually, on the first vase I made, I got all the way to the last feature ring on the bottom, and I was quick and I putting it together, and I didn't do the progression right. I actually went back the other direction. Fortunately, I caught it quick enough that I could soak the thing in some hot water and use a chisel to separate the seam fairly cleanly, let that dry and re-glue it properly. Then here shows the inside complete on the top half and the bottom half, and I turned it to the right dimension first and then sanded it smooth and then added the finish on that. You can see on the left one I've also added this extra ring, which won't be seen from the outside, and it doesn't have a cross in it, and it is just a plain birch in this case. I also, in lining the seams up, seeing this as a halfway piece, I didn't line the center seam all the way to the next seam, or to the center of the next seam itself. I just did a halfway there. Then I sanded with 80 grit through 400 grit sandpaper on that. Notice on the top half one, I masked off this area on this surface before applying the finish on it. And the reason is because that will be a glue surface once I cut the tenon in it to match, or excuse me, the rabbet in it to match the tenon that I'm going to cut in this one here. On the bottom half, it didn't matter that I get finish on it because I'm going to turn that down to 3/8 of an inch high anyway. I applied 3 coats of finish on both halves and let it dry at least 24 hours between coats, depending how warm the shop is. In this case, my shop was running about 72 degrees, 73 degrees, so it dried fairly quickly, and then I added 2 coats of wax. The finish I used was a Bush's oil. I had some leftovers from some bookcases I made, and this actually worked quite well. I was very pleased with it. And I applied the finish while it was mounted to the lathe, and again let it cure for 24 hours if it's at least 70 degrees Fahrenheit in your shop. I then lightly sanded with a Scotchbrite pad between coats. Used both the started with the brown Scotchbrite pad and then finished with the white one. And again, I applied 3 coats and ended with a couple coats of wax on it. And the wax I used, I like the Butcher's Bowling Alley wax that I had. Once the insides were finished, then it's time to start turning the tenon on the bottom half and a mating rabbet on the top half that would give a good snug fit between the two. You don't want it too tight that you have to really hammer it or clamp it on, but you want it to, you don't want it real loose either. And this is one of those times, you know, there's a lot of things on the lathe you don't have to be real exact on. You can sort of turn it by feel. This is not one of those. Take your time and make sure they fit nice and tight, just a little bit at a time to make sure that you get a good seal there. Then I mounted it to the lathe and applied glue to both halves. Being liberal on the inside, I didn't want a lot of it dribbling down the inside of the vase, so I was careful not to get too much on the inside there. And brought them together, make sure the cross progression is aligned correctly. And then on 2 of the vases I was able to just apply quill pressure and I had a really nice fit. On one of them it needed a little extra oomph on it, so I used clamps between the top and the bottom face plates to clamp it tight. And I actually was able to apply the first clamp on while it was on the lathe, so it was aligned, and then once I took it off, then I added the other 2 clamps. Once the glue was dry, then I removed the top faceplate. And before I mounted the faceplate, I had really marked the center and drilled a pilot hole for the drive of the live center that I could mount on the tailstock of the lathe. And then I mounted it on the lathe. Still used the faceplate on the bottom half, but now I'm using the live center on the top half. And I use this to then turn the vase flat or round again. It wasn't that far off, but once I started getting out this far with this many layers, it was starting to wobble just a little bit before I glued it together. Once I glued it together, then it really added some stability to that, and I could turn it round. Then when I was done with that, I finished turning it the rest of the way. And you notice now on both the bottom walnut piece and the top walnut piece, I didn't use the full thickness of it. I only used a ½ inch of that. But anyway, I got the whole thing turned. And the one thing that I will highly encourage, make sure you're using sharp chisels. It makes all the difference in the world for getting a nice clean cut and reducing the amount of sanding that you have to do. I found that the 3 seconds it takes to put a sharp edge on the chisels really was time well spent. And then on this I sanded like the inside 80 grit through 400 grit, then applied 3 to 5 coats of the Bush's oil finish, again 24 hours between coats, and then finished up with 2 coats of wax. Once the finish was dry, then I cut the top and the bottoms free. I used a Japanese handsaw for that. I know a lot of experienced turners will turn it down to almost nothing left, if not all the way through. I wasn't that courageous to do that, so I ended up cutting through with the handsaw the rest of the way. I then took it over to my 6-inch horizontal belt sander to sand each of the faces smooth. And take your time, be gentle on it. It's not a horse race on that. You don't want to have the thing flip out of your hands while it's on on the belt sander. Plus I didn't run the belt sander real fast on the Shopsmith either. I just took my time and got a nice finish, and then I ended up using the random orbit sander to give a nice flat finish on it, and you can see what happened there on this. And one of the things I'll point out here is I actually added my brand and the year on the second piece before I glued the whole thing up. That way I could sand this surface flat and get a nice flat a finished surface on that before I actually glued it onto the walnut first layer. Now the only thing that needs to be done now is I have a nice flat finish on the top here, but the end, it's a pretty crisp surface there. So I wanted to actually use a router to just put a round over on that to match the outside profile also. So I used just a handheld router, small router, and with a 1/4 inch round over trim bit in it. And just take your time. I actually did it with a climb cut to try to keep the tear out from too much on here. I got just a little bit here, but not much. And just go easy. You don't take the whole bite all at once, just a little bit at a time, and you get a nice finish. Then I completed with hand sanding, and then finished with 3 coats of finish both on the top and the bottom, and then added the wax to finish it up. So with that, here are the 2 styles of vases I completed, and the first one, ash and walnut, definitely a unique look to it, and the right one is a birch and walnut, and definitely a different look to it. And as I said earlier in the intro video, it's just amazing as you rotate that around how the colors of each of the segments changes, and with the light orientation on it. With that, I'm very pleased how these vases have turned out, and I hope this inspires you to try one of these yourself.
And thank you for watching the video on how I put the segmented vases together on this vase. And I've got one other thing that I want to talk to you about, sort of the spiritual significance I have of this. And I hope you've enjoyed that. And I also have attached some Bible verses that you can look at too. So thanks again for watching. And again, if you like it, give me a thumbs up, please. And I certainly welcome any comments or suggestions. Have a great day.
These are the Bible verses that I put together that were inspirational for me in designing and making this vase. There's 14 verses, one for each of the cross ring layers of the vase, and God is such an important part of my life, and I thank Him for His love and His grace to me, as well as Jesus dying on the cross for my sin. Crosses on the vase are representative of a stairway to heaven. Jesus is the only way to heaven. He is the way, the truth, and the life. If you have trusted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, I praise God for that. If not, I encourage you to study these verses about salvation. Without Jesus, we are lost. I pray that you will accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior today. I encourage you not to delay. No man knows what tomorrow may bring. I hope you find them encouraging to you too. I thank you for watching this video series on this segmented vase that I designed and put together. I would appreciate a thumbs up if you liked it, and welcome any comments or suggestions. Have a great day, everybody.